Salzburg, Bavaria, January 17th, 1943. At 10:17 p.m., 13 wooden steps complained softly beneath the military boots of Marcus Adler. He didn't turn on a single light. No flashlight. Every movement was measured, stripped down to the bare minimum of sound. One wrong noise was enough. Someone listening from the street. The neighbor Marta Köhler pressing her ear to the shared wall, or a night patrol passing too close to the small basement window, and everything would collapse in seconds. Marcus was wearing a Wehrmacht uniform, the same uniform that marched through the city every morning, that checked papers at checkpoints, that knocked on Jewish doors before dawn to tear families apart with typed orders. And yet, beneath his house, behind a wall sealed with fresh lime, old bricks, and 2 layers of plaster painted to match the rest of the basement, a Jewish girl named Leah Rosenfeld was breathing. She was 6.5 years old. She weighed barely 46 pounds. She had gone more than 400 consecutive nights without seeing the sun. She didn't cry. She had learned, brutally, silently, that crying made noise. She didn't ask about her mother either, because she understood that asking hurt more than staying quiet. She measured time by the footsteps above her head, by the creak of the basement door, by the dry click of the bolt. Every night, when Marcus went back upstairs, he left a metal plate on the dirt floor. Dark bread, 2 slices of sausage when there was any, and sometimes a glass of water. He never got too close, never looked her in the eyes. He only murmured the same sentence, always the same, so softly it felt like a thought rather than words. There'll be more upstairs tomorrow. Upstairs, the Reich radio played loudly enough for the neighbors to hear marches and late-night speeches, loud enough to erase any doubt that a loyal German lived there. Down below, Leah ate slowly, her hands shaking from the cold, clinging to one absolute certainty. If that man were discovered by the Gestapo, if someone came down those 13 steps with a search warrant, or if Major Otto Falk decided to personally inspect the homes of his subordinates, she would be the first to die. Marcus Adler knew it. Leah knew it too. And still, every night he sealed the entrance to the hiding place from the inside, not to lock a child in, but to keep the world out. Because in 1943, in the very heart of the Third Reich, hiding a Jew wasn't an act of kindness. It was high treason, and it carried an automatic death sentence. This story, kept for decades in secret files and whispered testimonies, was something almost no one dared to tell while those who lived it were still alive. Marcus Adler saved a life and paid the price in silence. By January 1943, Salzburg was no longer a city of postcards and music. It had become a key administrative cog of the Reich, a central node in the deportation machine that emptied entire neighborhoods each week with German precision. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 had stripped Jews of everything: citizenship, property, professions, even the right to sit on certain benches or walk certain streets. And in January 1942, at the Wannsee Conference, 15 Nazi bureaucrats had outlined, in 90 minutes, the systematic annihilation of millions of European Jews. They called it the final solution. Transports to the east departed with military accuracy from the central station. Families received notices barely a day in advance. There were no appeals, no mistakes, only sealed rail cars bound for places whose names froze the blood. Riga, Auschwitz. By early 1943, most German Jews had already been deported or murdered. In Salzburg, only a few hundred remained, hidden in total secrecy, surviving in damp basements and unventilated attics, with forged papers and the constant fear of being discovered. Hiding a Jew was considered direct betrayal of the Führer, punishable by immediate execution or deportation to to a concentration camp without trial. The system held itself together through incentivized civilian denunciations, permanent night patrols, surprise inspections, and a suffocating web of informants that included neighbors, co-workers, and even children trained to point out anything suspicious. Inside that nearly perfect machinery of surveillance, Marcus Adler committed the most unforgivable crime imaginable every single night: keeping Leah Rosenfeld alive. Marcus was 34 years old in January 1943. He had been born on March 15, 1909, in a small town near Nuremberg, the son of Wilhelm B., a Lutheran carpenter respected by everyone, and Anna B., an elementary school teacher who taught German literature and died slowly of tuberculosis when Marcus was only 12, leaving him alone with a broken man who was never the same again. He grew up in a Germany that had been defeated and deeply humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles. He lived through the catastrophic hyperinflation of 1923, when his father pushed a wheelbarrow full of banknotes just to buy a single loaf of bread, and people burned money in their stoves because it was worth more as fuel than as currency. He also lived through the mass unemployment of 1929 to 1933, when 1 out of every 3 Germans had no job, soup lines stretched for miles, and suicide became a common way out for desperate fathers. Like millions of young men of his generation, Marcus saw the meteoric rise of the Nazi Party between 1930 and 1933 as a tempting promise. Order after political chaos, decent work after years of humiliating unemployment, and a sense of national pride that seemed to be returning after 15 years of constant disgrace. He was not an ideological fanatic. He didn't attend rallies with religious fervor. He didn't raise his arm with the burning conviction of a true believer, nor did he memorize the Führer's speeches or racial theories with academic devotion. But he didn't protest either. He didn't question. He didn't openly oppose the regime. Like the vast majority of ordinary Germans, he accepted it because it offered stability, because it promised to restore Germany's lost greatness, and because it was infinitely easier, safer, and more comfortable to go with the current than to swim against it and risk everything. He enlisted in the Wehrmacht on April 3, 1938, 6 months after the annexation of Austria, not out of patriotic zeal, but because he urgently needed a stable, predictable income. His father had died of a stroke the year before, leaving him completely alone, with no family ties and no real reason to stay in his hometown, where every street reminded him of the parents he had lost. The army offered exactly what he needed: guaranteed meals 3 times a day, a bed in the barracks, a small monthly salary, and something vaguely resembling purpose when everything else had fallen apart. Because of his complete basic education and a natural ease with numbers and paperwork, he was assigned strictly administrative duties in Salzburg. He did not fight in the lightning invasion of Poland in September 1939. He was not part of the devastating campaign against France in May and June of 1940. He was not sent to the Eastern Front when Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. He was, quite simply, a desk soldier, a military bureaucrat who reviewed transport permits, coordinated supplies between depots, stamped personnel transfer documents, and verified endless ration lists. Efficient, meticulous. So quiet he was almost socially invisible. He never caused disciplinary problems. He never questioned orders. He never stood out for anything at all. The exact kind of man superiors forget, because he neither shines with exceptional excellence nor irritates with obvious incompetence, invisible within his own useful mediocrity. But Marcus Adler was hiding something far deeper, something the Nazi system could never measure in its performance reports, something that appeared in no line of his military file, something he himself didn't fully know he carried until it was tested in the most brutal way possible. A stubborn memory of witnessed injustices and a moral conscience that refused to die, even after years of relentless propaganda. On the night of November 9th to 10, 1938, during what the regime cynically called Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, named for the simultaneous roar of thousands of shattered shop windows, Marcus became a direct witness to something that would burn itself into his mind with unbearable clarity. He was 29 at the time, still a civilian, working exhausting shifts at a small printing shop that produced commercial forms. That night, he came home late after 14 straight hours, drained, his hands stained with black ink, thinking only of grabbing something to eat and collapsing into bed. At 10:30 p.m., he heard shouting in the street. A moment later came the unmistakable sound of glass breaking, lots of glass, one crash after another. He stepped to the window and saw a scene that permanently changed how he understood the world. Organized groups of men in brown SA uniforms, red armbands stamped with black swastikas, were systematically smashing the windows of every Jewish shop on the street. They used iron bars, hammers, whatever heavy objects they could get their hands on. The cascading crash of falling glass blended with screams of terror, barked orders in German, and something that disturbed him even more. Laughter, drunken laughter, intoxicated by destruction that was permitted, encouraged, and celebrated by the state itself. He watched them enter the watchmaker's shop of Mr. Gromberg, a 62-year-old man whose family business had stood on that street since 1897. 41 years of watches repaired with artisan precision. Trust built client by client, generation by generation. A reputation forged through decades of honest work. Marcus saw 3 SA men drag him by the collar of his torn shirt, while others methodically, almost ritually, destroyed everything that represented his life. Antique pocket watches were smashed against brick walls. Delicate tools were crushed under military boots. Century-old carved wooden display cases were reduced to splinters by axes and iron bars. Decades of effort erased in minutes of organized fury. He saw Rebecca Gromberg, the watchmaker's wife, about 35 years old, her dark hair disheveled, her face twisted in terror, screaming her husband's name with a desperation so raw, so animal, that Marcus felt his skin prickle. She was holding their small daughter, barely 2 years old, a child with dark curls and huge hazel eyes, crying without understanding anything. She couldn't comprehend why uniformed men were brutally beating her grandfather, why her mother's voice sounded like that, or why the entire world seemed to have gone mad in a single night. Marcus saw Mr. Gromberg bleeding heavily from a deep head wound after being struck with an iron bar. On his wrinkled face there was not only physical pain, but something worse: complete incomprehension. He tried to turn one last time toward his wife and granddaughter. He stretched out a trembling, blood-soaked hand in their direction, a final desperate gesture of farewell, instinctively knowing he would not return. Then they threw him violently, like a sack of potatoes, into a military truck alongside 20 other Jews arrested in the neighborhood that same night. And then Marcus saw something that marked him even more deeply than all the physical violence. The entire street, literally hundreds of people, watching from lit windows and half-open doors. German neighbors who had bought watches from that shop for decades. People who had trusted Mr. Gromberg with heirlooms passed down from their grandparents. Shopkeepers from nearby stores who had greeted him every morning for years. All of them watching in absolute silence, heavy, deliberate, and profoundly complicit. No one shouted, "Stop!" No one protested. No one lifted a single finger to intervene, not even as a symbolic gesture. They all watched like an audience at a grotesque theater, as if what was happening were inevitable, natural, acceptable. And Marcus Adler did nothing either. He stood frozen behind his closed window, the curtains barely parted, just enough to see without being seen, watching like the rest of the Germans on that street. Cowardly, complicit, doing absolutely nothing. He was 29 years old, healthy, in no immediate danger, no uniform forcing him to obey orders, no direct threat to his life. And yet he remained completely motionless, in a way that was shameful and cowardly. That night, after the trucks carried the detainees away and the street fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional crunch of shattered glass under patrol boots, Marcus did not sleep for a single minute. He sat on his narrow bed until a dirty gray dawn arrived, staring at his own hands as if they belonged to a stranger, asking himself what kind of man he really was. What kind of human being stays still while a 62-year-old man is beaten, while a 2-year-old child is torn from the arms of her terrified mother? He hadn't hit anyone. He hadn't broken anything. He hadn't actively participated in the violence. But he hadn't done anything to stop it either. He hadn't even tried. He hadn't even opened his mouth. And that inaction, that passive complicity, that cowardly silence, followed him for the next 3 years, until November 1941, when he would finally have the chance to act differently. The image never left him. Rebecca Gromberg screaming her husband's name. The 2-year-old girl crying with her hands stretched out toward her bloodied grandfather. Mr. Gromberg turning one last time with that look of absolute incomprehension. And the entire street, hundreds of people, respectable, decent Germans, watching in silence, not lifting a finger. Exactly like him. Marcus never forgot that scene. Not the organized violence, not the collective cowardice, not his own humiliating inaction. And although in November 1938 he did nothing, although he stayed behind his window like so many others who chose personal safety over moral courage, something inside him shifted that night, irreversibly. A barely perceptible crack in his passive acceptance of the regime. A tiny seed of moral resistance that would take exactly 3 years to germinate. But when it did, it would become the most dangerous, most important, and most human decision of his life. Walking down 13 steps every night for more than 1,000 nights to leave a plate of food for a 6-year-old Jewish girl hidden behind a false wall in his basement. 3 years later, in November 1941, Marcus was at his desk when a deportation list crossed his hands. Among hundreds of names, 2 stopped him cold. Gromberg, Rebecca, 37 years old, and Gromberg, Leah, 4 years old. Transport to Riga, Latvia, departure scheduled for November 22, 1941, the same woman, the same child he had seen crying 3 years earlier. They were living in Salzburg now, and in 48 hours, they would be sealed inside a railcar bound for Riga. Marcus knew exactly what Riga meant. Everyone in administration knew, even if no one said it out loud. The transports arrived, people vanished, the rail cars came back empty. There was no resettlement, only death. That night, Marcus went down to his basement with a hammer and a chisel. He worked for 6 straight hours without stopping, without weighing consequences or calculating odds, just acting. Behind the old coal furnace, he carved out a space 2 meters long and 1.5 meters wide, just enough for a small child to sit, to lie down, to exist without being seen. The next day before dawn, Marcus Adler knocked on the Gromberg's door. Rebecca opened it with swollen eyes, wrapped in the coat she had been ordered to bring. Leah was asleep in her arms. Marcus offered no explanations. He only said quietly, "Can I hide the child?" "Just her. You have 30 seconds to decide." Rebecca didn't cry. She didn't beg. She looked at her sleeping daughter, kissed her forehead, and gently placed her in Marcus's arms. She didn't say thank you. She didn't ask for anything. She only whispered, "If she dies, let it be in a bed, not in a rail car," and closed the door. Hours later, Rebecca Gromberg boarded the transport bound for Riga. She never came back. That same night, Marcus took Leah to the basement and spoke to her with controlled firmness. "You can't make noise. You can't move when people are upstairs. If someone finds you, I will die first, and then you will. Do you understand?" Leah was 4 years old. She nodded without fully understanding, but she learned quickly. For the first few months, Marcus lived in constant fear. Every knock on the door made him flinch. Every visit from a colleague left him rigid. Every greeting from Marta Köhler, the widowed neighbor, gave him the sensation that she knew, that everyone knew, and that it was only a matter of time. But weeks passed, then months, and no one came down to the basement. Marcus built a precise routine. At 10:17 p.m. every night, he went down with food. At 6:30 a.m., he carried the chamber pot upstairs and left fresh water. On Sundays, when the house was empty, he opened the small basement window for 15 minutes to let clean air in. Leah didn't speak. She just breathed deeply, as if she were trying to store that air in her lungs for the entire week. Marcus never asked her about her mother. He never tried to comfort her. He knew that one word too many could shatter the fragile balance that kept them alive. But Leah watched him. She counted his steps. She memorized the sound of his voice. And though Marcus never knew it, she began to count the days by marking the damp brick 1 mark per day, more than 400 by the time January 1943 arrived. The first real obstacle came in March 1943, when Major Otto Falk, Marcus's superior, ordered a surprise inspection of the homes of all the soldiers under his command. Officially, it was to check hygiene and order. In reality, it was to look for contraband, desertion, or subversive activity. Marcus received the notice on a Tuesday. The inspection would take place on Friday at 3:00 p.m., 3 days' notice. Enough to clean, not enough to dismantle a hiding place. That night, he went down to the basement and explained it to Leah. "On Friday, an officer will come. He will search the entire house. If you make noise, if you breathe loudly or cough, we'll be discovered. You have to stay completely still for 2 hours, no matter what happens, and you can do it." Leah, now 6.5 years old, nodded without asking questions. On Friday, Falk arrived with an assistant and a soldier carrying a flashlight and an iron bar to test the walls. Marcus greeted them with an impeccable military salute. The house was spotless, everything in its place. Falk inspected the kitchen, the bedroom, the bathroom. Perfect. Then he looked toward the basement. "What's down there?" "Coal. Old tools. Nothing else." They went down the 13 steps. The soldier struck the walls. The sound was solid, compact. No suspicious echoes. Behind the false wall, less than 5 feet away, Leah lay face down, her hands pressed over her mouth, holding her breath until her lungs burned, hearing the blows, the voices, the boots drawing closer. Falk stopped in front of the wall, ran his hand over the surface, and pointed to a stain. "This wall is damp. It's the neighbor's pipe. It's been leaking since winter. "I've already requested permission to repair it," Marcus replied. Falk stared at the stain for 5 more seconds. Then he nodded and went back upstairs. 15 minutes later, he signed the report. Everything in order. Reliable soldier. Marcus waited 2 hours before going back down to the basement. Then 3 more, just in case Falk decided to return without warning. At 10:17 p.m., Marcus came down with the plate of food. Leah was shaking, her lips purple from holding her breath for so long. She hadn't cried. She hadn't made a sound. She had done exactly what was asked of her. Marcus set the plate on the floor and, for the first time in months, said more than usual, "You did well." Leah didn't answer, but that night she ate every piece of bread, leaving not a single crumb. Dr. Ernst Langer was the barracks military physician, a 52-year-old man, quiet, with precise hands. Before the war, he had been a pediatrician. Now he limited himself to signing medical leave forms and health certificates. In April 1943, Marcus began showing obvious symptoms: chronic insomnia, weight loss, a persistent tremor in his hands. Langer summoned him for an examination. During the checkup, he noticed something out of place. Marcus had dirt under his fingernails. Damp dirt, basement dirt. He didn't ask a single question, but his gaze lingered on those hands a second longer than necessary before he wrote in the report: mild work-related stress, reduced night shifts. 2 weeks later, Marcus found an anonymous package on his desk. Inside were 3 bottles of children's vitamins and a note with no signature: for children with a lack of sunlight. He never knew whether Langer understood exactly what was hidden in his basement, but every month after that, a similar package appeared: vitamins, bandages, children's aspirin. Langer never spoke, never asked anything. And yet he became the silent accomplice who helped keep alive a girl who officially did not exist. Marta Köhler, the 61-year-old widowed neighbor, was the danger without a uniform. She had lost her husband in the First World War and her son on the Eastern Front. She lived alone, always glued to her window, watching everything with a mix of patriotic vigilance and desperate loneliness. She knew Marcus's schedule in detail and had noticed something odd. He bought more food than a single man needed. Extra bread, milk he never drank, always from different shops. In May, she knocked on his door to ask for sugar. Marcus opened it only a crack, handed her the sugar, and closed it with cold politeness. That night, Marta sat by the shared wall and listened. At first, she heard only the radio and ordinary footsteps. But a week later, at 10:30 p.m., she heard something different. A door creaking, steps going down, silence for 15 minutes, then steps going up. The pattern repeated night after night. Marta began to suspect something without proof, guided only by intuition. And in 1943, intuition was enough to ruin a life. In July, Salzburg was bombed by the British RAF for 43 minutes. Marcus's house wasn't hit directly, but the explosions cracked the basement walls, and a fissure split the false wall. Marcus worked for 5 straight hours repairing it, removing plaster, reinforcing it with boards, covering it with fresh lime, his hands bleeding, certain that if morning came before he finished, everything would be over. By 6:45 a.m., the wall looked identical to the rest. No one would notice the difference. But time was no longer on his side. Inspections became more frequent, neighbors more suspicious. And on August 15, 1943, Marta Köhler filed a report with the Gestapo. "I suspect my neighbor is hiding subversive activity in his basement. He buys excessive amounts of food, and there are nocturnal noises." 5 days later, at 8 a.m., 2 agents knocked on Marcus's door. This wasn't a scheduled inspection. It was a surprise visit from the secret police. Routine check. Won't take long. One agent inspected the kitchen. The other went straight to the basement. Down there, Leah remained perfectly still, in a near-suspended state. Minimal breathing, relaxed body, blank mind. The agent lit every corner with his flashlight and struck the walls. The sound was solid, until he noticed something on the floor, a tiny footprint from a child's shoe. He knelt and ran a finger over the mark. Do you have children? No. Nieces or nephews who visit? No. The agent stared at the footprint for about 10 more seconds. Then he stood up. It's old, probably from the previous tenant. They checked the documents. Everything was in order. They left. But before stepping outside, one of them paused for a moment and said quietly, Adler, be careful what you keep in your basement. There were neighbors who watched too closely, and that was not a direct accusation, but a clear warning. Marcus understood it immediately. He was being observed. The real climax came in October 1943, and it didn't arrive with bombs or gunfire, but with a single piece of paper. Transfer orders to the Eastern Front. Departure October 25th, 15 days to resolve his entire life. Marcus knew exactly what that meant. If he left, Leah would die. No one else knew she existed, and the basement would become her silent grave. For 3 nights he didn't sleep, not out of fear of dying in combat, but from the certainty that he would be condemning a 6-year-old girl to starve to death in the dark. On October 13th, he made a decision and went to see Dr. Langer. I need a medical certificate declaring me unfit for combat, he said. The diagnosis doesn't matter, but I have to stay here. Langer looked at him in silence, closed the door, and asked bluntly, How long have you been hiding that child? Marcus didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence was enough. Langer took out a form and wrote that non-commissioned officer Marcus Adler showed advanced signs of pulmonary tuberculosis, unfit for service in a combat zone, requiring prolonged treatment in a local administrative post. He signed it and handed it over. This will give you 6 months, maybe a year, he said. But sooner or later, someone will review this diagnosis, and when that happens, I will fall as well. Because I'm a doctor, and I swore to save lives, not to decide which ones deserve to be saved. The certificate was accepted, and Marcus was not transferred. But Otto Falk began to suspect. 3 weeks later, he ordered a second examination. An external specialist evaluated Marcus for 2 hours. X-rays, auscultation, blood tests. The conclusion was unequivocal. There were no signs of active tuberculosis. Marcus was summoned to a disciplinary meeting on November 8th. Falk was there, along with the medical specialist and 2 Gestapo officers. The room was small, windowless, lit only by a desk lamp that cast hard shadows on the walls. The air was stale, hot, heavy with the smell of old tobacco and nervous sweat. Falk placed the falsified medical certificate on the scratched wooden table, smoothed it with his palm, and stared at it for several seconds before speaking. Adler, this document is fraudulent. We have conclusive medical evidence that Dr. Langer lied in an official diagnosis, and that you knew it. You deliberately requested it to avoid transfer to the front. Do you understand the seriousness of this? This is desertion by medical fraud. This is treason against the Reich's war effort. Explain your actions. At that moment, Marcus could have confessed everything. He could have dropped to his knees and begged for mercy, invented an excuse about fear of combat or psychological trauma, cried, trembled, shown the terror that lived in every cell of his body. But sitting in that hard chair, facing 4 men with absolute legal power to execute him within 24 hours without trial or appeal. Something unexpected broke inside him. It wasn't courage. It wasn't heroism. It was total exhaustion from living in constant fear. Almost 2 years of going down the stairs every night without knowing if it would be the last. Sleeping in fragments. Waiting for the knock on the door. Obsessively checking every inch of the false wall every morning. Living with the certainty that a minimal mistake, a barely audible sound, a misplaced shadow, would mean immediate death for him and a slow, horrible death for a 6-year-old girl who trusted completely that he would keep his silent promise that tomorrow there would be more. Marcus raised his eyes, looked directly at Otto Falk, and with a voice that tried to stay steady while carrying 2 years of compressed emotional exhaustion, said something he didn't even know he was going to say until the words left his mouth. Because I refuse to kill Russian peasants on frozen plains for a regime that built gas chambers to murder Jewish children. I will not die in Ukraine defending a system that turned my country into an industrial factory of genocide. That is my explanation, Major, and I do not withdraw it. The silence that followed was so complete, so heavy, that Marcus could hear the ticking of the wall clock, the sound of his own breathing, the rapid thud of his heart pounding in his ears. One of the Gestapo officers sprang to his feet. The chair screeched against the wooden floor, and his right hand moved by reflex toward the Walter P-38 in his holster. In his eyes there was a mix of genuine shock and ideological fury. He had just heard a direct confession of treason against the Reich, spoken with an almost suicidal calm. Then Otto Falk raised his right hand in a sharp, commanding gesture, the gesture of an officer used to being obeyed without question. Sit down. Now. The agent hesitated, torn between his training to arrest traitors immediately and the military hierarchy that placed Falk above him in that room. After 3 seconds of palpable tension, he sat back down slowly, never taking his eyes off Marcus, like someone who has just witnessed a capital crime and intends to remember every detail for the inevitable trial. Falk closed his eyes and took 3 deep breaths, as if trying to contain something dangerous and deeply buried. His hands, always steady when signing orders with bureaucratic precision, trembled slightly on the table. When he opened his eyes again, there was something different in them. Something Marcus couldn't quite name. Respect, horror, understanding, or perhaps a painful personal memory. Adler, Falk said, his voice now more tired than authoritarian, more human than military. Do you fully understand what you just said out loud, in front of 2 Gestapo officers and a Wehrmacht superior? That is direct and explicit treason against the German state, a verbal admission of conscious sympathy with the enemy and a public rejection of the fundamental ideology of the Third Reich. I understand perfectly, Major, and I stand by every word, Marcus replied. Falk looked at the fraudulent medical certificate for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably no more than 30 seconds. Then, in a deliberate, almost ceremonial gesture, he picked it up with both hands and tore it into 4 exactly equal pieces, slowly, letting them fall onto the table like ashes. This document never existed. There is no physical evidence of medical fraud. Dr. Langer made a diagnostic error understandable under the extreme pressure of wartime conditions and inadequate equipment. Diagnostic errors happen. They are not crimes. He looked up. Adler, you are hereby officially and permanently assigned to administrative duties in Salzburg by direct order of mine. Your experience in logistical documentation and supply coordination is far too valuable to waste on the Eastern Front, where you would be dead in 6 weeks like 90% of the transferred personnel. He straightened. This disciplinary meeting is officially concluded. Everyone out of my office immediately, except the 2 Gestapo officers. You will stay. The agents protested at the same time, their voices overlapping in bureaucratic outrage. Major Falk, this is unacceptable. We have just heard a direct confession of treason. We have a legal obligation to… Falk cut them off before they could finish the sentence, rising from his chair in a movement that, without being physically threatening, concentrated the full authority of 20 years of military service. I have full administrative authority over personnel assignments in my district under Wehrmacht Regulation 347b. Section 3, Paragraph 7. Adler is a soldier under my direct operational command, and his administrative efficiency is necessary and valuable to the logistical operations of this garrison. If you have formal objections to my command decision, you may and must submit them in writing through the official channels to the Superior Command of Military District SEPTA in Stuttgart. That administrative appeal will take a minimum of 6 weeks to process under current protocols, and until then, my assignment order remains valid and legally binding. Is that absolutely clear, or do you require me to cite the full regulations? The 2 Gestapo officers exchanged looks of impotent fury. One of them began writing angrily in his black notebook, documenting everything for a report that would move up the chain of command. Falk watched them with a barely contained calm and added, his voice colder now, edged with threat. And I formally remind you that any direct action against active military personnel without prior written authorization from the appropriate command constitutes illegal interference in Wehrmacht operations, pursuant to the Führer's decree of April 1941, Article 12. You may investigate as much as you wish, report whatever you deem necessary, and draft reports as detailed as your training allows. But you may not arrest, detain, or interrogate a soldier under my command without my explicit written authorization. Is that absolutely unequivocal and completely clear? The 2 agents stood up without answering and left the office with stiff movements, loaded with contained rage and bureaucratic humiliation, their faces marked by the silent promise that this was not over and that they would escalate the case through every channel available. When the door closed, Falk remained standing behind his desk for several seconds without looking at Marcus. Then, without turning around, he spoke in a voice so low that Marcus had to lean forward to hear it. Leave my office now, and never, under any conceivable circumstance, say out loud what you said here today. The next time those officers get an opportunity, and they will, there will be no one to protect you. Not even me. Because by then I will be dead or under arrest for having protected you today. Now go, before I change my mind. Marcus raised his trembling hand in a military salute, turned halfway around, and left without saying a word, his legs barely holding him up. He never knew for certain why Falk protected him that day, and he never found out. The major never mentioned the matter again, and there was never another conversation between them beyond routine orders and strictly professional administrative reports. Years later, in 1947, when German military archives began to be declassified, one detail came to light. Otto Falk had lost his younger brother on the Eastern Front in 1942, disappeared without a trace after being arrested by the Gestapo for defeatist remarks, and sent to a disciplinary battalion from which he never returned. Falk was not a savior or a hidden hero. He was simply a Wehrmacht officer who despised the Gestapo giving orders over soldiers under his command. That day, he had an opportunity to say no, and he took it. That night, Marcus went down to the basement and said quietly, "You're going to survive." Dr. Langer was arrested 3 weeks later, not because of Marcus's certificate, but because another soldier he had helped was caught deserting and mentioned his name. Langer was sent to Dachau and died there in February 1945, 2 months before liberation, at the age of 53. Marcus kept going down every night. 10:17 p.m., 13 steps, the same plate of food without change, while the war continued to transform. In January 1944, the bombings intensified. In June came the Normandy landings, and in April 1945, American troops were already close to Salzburg. On April 28, 1945, American forces entered the city. Resistance was minimal. Within 24 hours, Salzburg was under Allied control. Marcus heard the gunfire drawing closer, the tanks rolling through the streets, and when the noise finally stopped, when silence settled in a way that felt different, he went down to the basement one last time and tore open the false wall with his bare hands. Leah was sitting on the floor. She had just turned 8 years old. She weighed 48 pounds. She had spent more than 1,000 consecutive days living in the dark. "You can come out now," he said. Leah didn't move, not out of fear, but because she had forgotten how to walk under sunlight. Marcus lifted her into his arms, carried her up the 13 steps, opened the door, and set her down in the street. Leah looked up at the sky for the first time in more than 3 years. The sun burned her eyes. The wind struck her face. The noise of a liberated city was overwhelming. And then, for the first time since her mother had handed her away, she cried. An American officer approached and asked who she was. Marcus said she was a Jewish child and that he had hidden her for more than 3 years. The officer looked at him with suspicion, another German soldier with a convenient story, until Leah, who had not spoken out loud for over 1,000 days, said clearly, "It's true. He saved me." Marcus was arrested as a precaution, suspected of war crimes, and held for 6 weeks while his case was investigated. Leah was sent to a refugee center where she told her story. The basement, the soldier who came down every night, the plate of food, and the words, "Tomorrow there will be more." An intelligence officer verified dates, names, and addresses. He interviewed neighbors. He found Marta Köhler, who confessed through tears that she had reported Marcus. He uncovered inspection records and the vitamin packages sent by Dr. Langer. On June 15, 1945, Marcus was released. He was not charged, but he was not honored either. The world did not yet know how to classify a German soldier who had saved a Jewish child. He returned to a ruined Salzburg with no family, no job, and no clear future. But with something few people had. An 8-year-old girl who called him the man who gave me mornings. Leah never saw her mother again. Rebecca was murdered in Riga just weeks after her deportation. Her father died in a forced labor camp. Leah was the only survivor of her family. Between 1945 and 1947, she lived in a Jewish orphanage. Marcus visited every Sunday. They didn't talk much. He would sit beside her and bring bread. The same bread he had carried down to the basement for more than 3 years. In 1948, Jewish organizations helped survivors emigrate to Palestine, and Leah was included in one of the transports. The day before she left, she came to say goodbye. They sat together in the same basement where she had spent over 1,000 days, now without a false wall, just an empty corner. Marcus asked her a question he had never voiced before. "Why did you do it?" She took a long time to answer. Then she said that her mother had given him 30 seconds to decide whether he was a good man or a coward, and that he had chosen not to be a coward. Leah took his hand. She didn't say thank you. They both knew that word wasn't enough. She only repeated, "Tomorrow there will be more." and Marcus smiled for the first time in 4 years. Leah emigrated to Palestine in 1948. She married a survivor of Auschwitz in 1960. She had 3 children and worked as a teacher for 42 years. She never spoke publicly until 1985, when historians from Yad Vashem contacted her. Her testimony lasted 3 hours, during which she repeated again and again, "He didn't save me because I was Jewish. He saved me because I was a child. That's what made him different." Marcus never left Salzburg. He worked as a carpenter for 30 years. He married briefly in 1952 and later divorced. He had no children. He lived alone in the same house and never sought recognition. When asked about the war, he always answered the same way. "I did what I had to do. Nothing more." In 1984, Yad Vashem declared him righteous among the nations and invited him to a ceremony in Jerusalem. He declined the invitation and sent a short letter instead. "I appreciate the honor, but I do not deserve it. I only did what any decent person should have done." The true heroism was always in the child who survived in silence. Marcus Adler died in Salzburg on March 12, 1991, at the age of 82. He died in his bed, in the same house and the same room, directly above the basement where he had saved a life. 12 people attended his funeral. One of them was Leah Rosenfeld, who had traveled from Israel with her 3 children and 7 grandchildren. When it was her turn to speak, Leah didn't read a prepared speech. She simply said the sentence she had heard more than 1,000 times. "Tomorrow there will be more." Then she added quietly, "Because of you, there was." Years later, a plaque was placed in the basement of that house. Its inscription was simple. In this basement, between 1941 and 1945, Leah Rosenfeld, a 6-year-old Jewish child, was hidden by the soldier Marcus Adler. He risked his life every day so she could see one more tomorrow. This is the story of a man who chose humanity over obedience. Leah Rosenfeld died in Tel Aviv in 2018 at the age of 81. In her will, she left a very specific instruction. She wanted to be buried with a small wooden box she had kept for 73 years. Inside was a simple object, a rusted metal plate. The same plate Marcus placed on the floor every night. The plate that meant there would be a tomorrow. Today, that plate is displayed at the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem with an inscription engraved by Leah herself. More than 1,000 nights. More than 1,000 mornings. One life saved. One righteous man. Below it, in smaller letters, "He never knew that I loved him like a father." The story of Marcus and Leah was almost never told, not because it was forgotten, but because both chose silence. He did so because he was convinced he had done nothing heroic. She did so because remembering hurt too much. But in 1985, when Leah finally decided to speak, the world learned something the Nazi regime had tried to destroy and never could erase: the human capacity to choose decency in the midst of absolute horror. Marcus Adler was not a movie hero, not a political rebel, not an idealist. He was a 34-year-old man wearing a uniform that represented the most efficient killing machine in history, who every night walked down 13 steps and left a plate of food for more than 1,000 consecutive nights, with no recognition, no witnesses, no guarantee that it would matter. Only the certainty that a 6-year-old girl deserved to see the sunrise. And when the world finally learned that story, one unanswered question remained. How many other Marcuses were there? How many other basements hid lives in silence? How many other plates of food were set down every night, unseen by anyone? We will never know. Because real heroes rarely speak. They don't seek monuments. They simply walk down the stairs, keep their promise, and walk back up. And when someone asks them why they did it, they answer the same way Marcus did. It was the right thing to do. Nothing more. If you know someone from your city or your country whose story deserves to be told, write it in the comments. The next invisible hero might be yours.